spending took off again. You know, as our mothers tell us, don't let it burn a hole in your pocket. It burned a hole through the pocket, through the floor, almost through the planet.
Well, you know, we've had long-range structural challenges for a while, but they've gotten a lot worse in recent years. You know, we went from significant deficits to surpluses through the 1990s, but then what happened was all the budget controls expired, entitlements were expanded, spending increased dramatically, and tax cuts were enacted. The combination of all those factors took us from surpluses to huge deficits and caused the long-range imbalance to be much worse.
Now in 2001, this is what our fiscal future looked like for the next 40-plus years. At that point in time, keep in mind we had something called a surplus. Those days are gone. We had a surplus and we were on the path to pay off all the debt of the United States. So where are we today? This is where we are today, looking roughly 35 years into the future, based upon reasonable assumptions. Rather than not having any interest on the federal debt, this is the fastest growing expense over the long term. And we are on a path where rather than having fiscal sustainability for 40-plus years, the model that we use at GAO to generate these simulations actually crashes in a little over 40 years. Needless to say, that's not an acceptable outcome.
That's a huge deficit. There isn't the cash flow necessary to run the government, in addition to the fact invest in the kinds of things that we as Americans find important, and that is education, healthcare, innovation, technology, as well as being a leader in general around the world. We will not have the capacity to do that. Business can't outspend itself, and the government certainly cannot outspend itself. That is going to have a general effect on business.
The status quo is not an option. Our financial condition is worse than advertised. The short term is not the problem.
We're spending more money than we take in. We're charging it to our national credit card. We're running up interest on a compounded basis, and we're expecting our kids and our grandkids to pay it off. And on our current path, one can see that if we don't make changes, it won't be too long before we're not going to be able to make our minimum payment.
The problem are our large and growing long-range structural deficits. And it's based largely on known demographics and rising health care costs. And if there's one thing that could bankrupt America, it's health care cost.
This financial tidal wave is going to wash over us within the next decade or more as baby boomers retire and all of the programs' costs then increase exponentially. And if we wait until then, we're going to be in a real financial bind.
Some people say we can grow our way out of this problem. Those that say that, I would respectfully suggest, number one, haven't studied economic history as to what type of economic growth rates we've been able to maintain over time, and secondly, may not be very proficient at math.
We need to address this issue, and we need more members of Congress that are willing to admit the obvious, that the status quo is unsustainable.
We're a great country, but we face serious sustainability challenges, which we are not effectively addressing. The United States is the only superpower on the face of the earth today, with unparalleled economic, military, social, cultural, and other influence. Only superpower on earth. So how many people believe that of the 28 major OECD nations, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, of which we're one of those, how many believe that on a broad portfolio of statistics, economic, social, environmental, energy, public finance, etc., healthcare, how many believe that we're number one? Please raise your hand. Now, this is America now. All right, we got one hand, we got two hands. I'm not going to auction anything off. All right, how many people believe we're top 5? Well, I hate to tell you, we are number 16 out of 28. And as a certified public accountant, I can tell you officially that's below average. We must do better. The next president, whoever he or she is, in whichever party, needs to make fiscal responsibility one of their top 3 priorities.
And if they don't, I think we're in trouble.
Voters have to start demanding of politicians that they be more candid about the nature of the problem, the reality of this problem, and some of the tough choices that will need to be made.
So what do we have to do? We have to have more truth and transparency about where we are financially. We need to engage in a public education effort to help the people understand where we are, where we're headed, the consequences of inaction, the need for dramatic and fundamental reforms, the importance of doing it sooner rather than later. We need to implement some performance metrics. We need to know which federal spending programs and tax policies are working and which ones aren't working.
All tax cuts aren't created equal. Some tax cuts stimulate the economy and therefore can end up partially paying for themselves. Very few tax cuts pay for themselves in their entirety. There's no question that we're going to need to look to additional revenues in order to solve our problem. But it's very important that we maintain low tax burdens in order to maximize economic growth, maximize disposable income, and maintain our competitive advantages compared to Europe. We're really going to have to restructure entitlement programs and constrain spending, but some additional revenues will be needed.
You know, the government spends $2.7 trillion a year. It issues tax preferences that result in foregone revenues of $800 and $900 billion a year. It ends up issuing tens of thousands of pages of regulations a year, and for the most part, it has no idea whether these programs are working or not. It has no idea whether we're achieving positive outcomes. And that's why I'm pushing for a set of key national indicators for the United States that are economic, safety, security, social, environmental indicators to help inform strategic planning with regard to both spending and tax policy, as well as regulatory policy. We need to reimpose tough budget controls and tough legislative process controls, because we need to learn the rule of holes. When you're in a hole, the first thing you do is stop digging.
So we need to stop the bleeding, and then we need to figure out how we're going to end up dealing with that $50 trillion imbalance. It means reforming Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. It means reprioritizing and re-engineering the base of both spending policy and tax policy in the United States, because most of the policies and programs of the U.S. government are based on the 1940s to the 1970s. Some of them are working, some of them aren't.
But even if we balance the budget, that doesn't do much to help us with our $50 trillion number, which, by the way, 5 years from now will be about $65 trillion plus.
Your Child's Inheritance, Debt, is a co-production of For Our Grandchildren, a Social Security education program, and TPT's Minnesota channel, with additional funding provided by Skyline, a national designer and builder of trade show exhibits.